Have you ever wondered why tens of thousands of soldiers from Britain, Australia, and New Zealand died on a distant peninsula in Turkey, a place most of them had never even heard of before 1915? Why did a campaign once believed to be the key to ending the First World War swiftly turn into one of its greatest tragedies? A disaster that left more than 130,000 men buried beneath foreign soil? Was it the product of flawed strategy or the triumph of a nation's unyielding defense? To understand Gallipoli is to step into one of history's most painful lessons, a story of courage, pride, and unimaginable loss. It was early, 1915. The Great War had reached a deadlock in the muddy trenches of Western Europe. From Flanders to the Somme, soldiers were trapped in a nightmare of barbed wire, artillery fire, and death without progress. Neither side could move. The British and French high commands, desperate to break the stalemate, began searching for another front, a new path to victory. Their eyes turned eastward to the Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe, which had joined the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. If the Allies could strike the Ottomans swiftly, they could open a sea route through the Dardanelles Strait, connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, and send vital supplies to their struggling ally, Russia. This was not just a military plan. It was a grand vision, one daring operation that could knock the Ottomans out of the war, boost Allied morale, and perhaps shorten the entire conflict. Among those who believed most fervently in the plan was a young, ambitious politician, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. Confident in the might of the Royal Navy, he proposed an audacious idea. Instead of wasting more lives in the trenches of France, the Allies should strike decisively at the Dardanelles. A powerful naval assault, he claimed, would crush Ottoman defenses and allow Allied ships to sail straight to Constantinople, today's Istanbul, forcing the enemy to surrender. Maps were drawn. Admirals debated. Generals hesitated. Yet the promise of a quick victory was too tempting to resist. In February 1915, the plan was set in motion. The great fleets of Britain and France gathered in the Aegean Sea, an awe-inspiring sight of steel and smoke. Battleships like Queen Elizabeth, Agamemnon, and Bouvet loomed over the waves, their cannons ready to unleash devastation. From the cliffs of Gallipoli, Ottoman gunners watched and waited, their defenses hidden among the rocks. No one on either side could imagine that the waters before them, the narrow strait known as the Dardanelles, would soon become a graveyard of ships, men, and hope itself. By March 1915, the Allies were ready to strike. The Dardanelles shimmered under the spring sun, calm, deceptively peaceful, its narrow waters hiding deadly secrets beneath. The plan seemed straightforward. The Allied fleet, 18 of the most powerful warships of Britain and France, would force its way through the strait, destroy the coastal fortifications, and sail straight to Constantinople. Once the Ottoman capital fell, the empire would crumble, but maps and confidence are poor weapons against geography and determination. On March 18, 1915, the Great Armada advanced. The thunder of naval guns echoed across the sea as shells rained down on the Ottoman forts guarding both sides of the strait. Kale, Setalber, Nanikali. The sky turned gray with smoke and dust. For a brief moment, it looked as though Churchill's bold gamble might succeed. Fort after fort fell silent. British officers on deck cheered as the fleet pressed forward until, suddenly, the sea itself struck back. Unseen by Allied reconnaissance, the Ottomans had laid fresh minefields during the night. As the ships moved deeper into the narrow waters, disaster unfolded in quick succession. First, the French battleship Bouvet hit a mine. In less than 2 minutes, she capsized and vanished beneath the waves, taking over 600 men with her. Minutes later, the British ship Irresistible was crippled by another explosion. Then came Ocean, struck as it tried to rescue survivors. The proud battleships of the Royal Navy burned and sank, victims not of gunfire, but of invisible weapons anchored in silence. By dusk, 3 warships lay at the bottom of the Dardanelles, and the sea was littered with oil debris and bodies. The Allied command was stunned. What was meant to be a swift naval triumph had become a disaster. The fleet withdrew, battered and humiliated. Churchill's grand vision was in jeopardy, but he refused to give up. If the Navy could not break through, then the Army would. A new plan was hastily drawn, a massive amphibious invasion of the Gallipoli peninsula. The idea was to land troops on key beaches, capture the heights overlooking the Dardanelles, and clear the way for the Navy to advance once more. The chosen landing sites would soon become names etched in blood and memory. Cape Helles, Suvla Bay, and Anzac Cove, where thousands of young Australians and New Zealanders, far from home, would face their first baptism of fire. But the planners in London and Cairo made a fatal mistake. They underestimated their enemy. They imagined the Ottoman defense weak, their soldiers poorly trained. They were wrong. The Turks were led by officers who knew the terrain better than any map could show. Among them was a rising commander named Mustafa Kemal, whose name would one day become legend. The stage was set. The beaches of Gallipoli waited, silent, rugged, and unforgiving. And as dawn approached on April 25, 1915, the men of the Allied Expeditionary Force prepared to land, unaware that many would never see another sunrise. The night before the landing was eerily calm. Across the dark waters of the Aegean, hundreds of ships drifted silently toward the Gallipoli Peninsula. The sea glowed faintly beneath a pale moon, and on the decks, young soldiers, many no older than 20, whispered nervously. Clutching their rifles and letters from home, they were men from faraway lands, from Melbourne, Auckland, Sydney, Wellington, answering a call they barely understood. They had been told this would be a short campaign, a glorious adventure. But as they gazed toward the black silhouette of the Turkish coast, an uneasy silence filled their hearts. At 4:30 a.m., the first boats of the Anzac troops, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, reached the shore. They were supposed to land on a wide, flat beach. Instead, strong currents had carried them north, into a narrow, steep cove surrounded by cliffs and ridges. Later, it would be known as Anzac Cove. The men jumped into the cold water waist-deep and struggled toward the sand. At first, there was only the sound of waves and boots splashing. Then, gunfire. From the ridgelines above, the darkness erupted in flashes of light. Ottoman machine guns opened fire, cutting through the still morning air. Bullets tore into the men as they waded ashore. Some fell face first into the water. Others crawled desperately toward the dunes, their rifles lost to the surf. The cliffs loomed above them like walls of death. The Anzacs had nowhere to go but up. Amid the chaos, one man's voice rose above the din. Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, commander of the 19th Division. When his soldiers began to retreat, fearing they would be overrun, Kemal stopped them with a single order. "I am not ordering you to fight, I am ordering you to die." Those words became immortal. His men dug in, refusing to yield an inch. From their high positions, they poured relentless fire down upon the invaders. By mid-morning, the beach had become a nightmare. Smoke choked the air. The cries of the wounded echoed off the cliffs. The sea, once silver under the dawn, turned red. Ships offshore tried to support the landings with artillery fire, but their shells often missed, killing their own men instead. Small groups of NZACs managed to reach the lower slopes, clinging to the rocks and scrub. But for every meter gained, dozens of lives were lost. Meanwhile, at Cape Helles, the British forces faced the same fate. Their landings turned into slaughter as Ottoman defenders, hidden in trenches, unleashed devastating volleys. The beaches were so thick with bodies that boats could barely land. By sunset, thousands lay dead or dying. What was meant to be a swift and heroic assault had become pure carnage. The living dug shallow holes in the sand for cover. Too exhausted to move, too terrified to sleep. That night, as the moon rose over the burning coastline, both sides could hear the wounded calling out in the darkness, voices fading one by one. And so began a struggle that would last not days, but 8 long merciless months. When dawn broke after the first day of landings, the beaches of Gallipoli were unrecognizable. Bodies lay twisted among the rocks. Rifles, packs, and helmets were scattered across the sand. The sea gently rolled in, washing over the fallen, as if trying to erase the horror that had unfolded. Yet, the worst was still to come. By the end of April 1915, the invasion had ground to a halt. Neither side could advance. The once daring assault had devolved into a grim and static war of trenches, a smaller, harsher reflection of the Western Front. The Anzacs dug into the cliffs above the beach, carving shallow trenches into the hard, dusty soil. The Ottomans did the same on the ridges above them. Between the two lines lay a narrow strip of land, no man's land, littered with corpses, broken rifles, and the stench of death. Days turned into weeks. The summer sun scorched the peninsula, turning it into an oven. The men suffered from thirst, heat, and swarms of flies that covered everything: food, wounds, even the dead. Disease spread faster than bullets. Dysentery, typhoid, and infections claimed more lives than enemy fire. At night, the temperature plunged. Men huddled together in their shallow holes, listening to the endless chorus of gunfire and the distant moans of the dying. Letters home spoke of bravery, but also of despair. "We live like rats," one Australian soldier wrote. "We dig, we sweat, we bleed, and we bury our friends in silence." Repeated attempts to break the stalemate failed. In August, the Allies launched a new offensive at Suvla Bay, hoping to seize high ground and finally push inland. It was a disaster. Confused orders, poor leadership, and brutal counterattacks crushed the assault within days. The Ottomans, though outgunned and underfed, held firm. Mustafa Kemal's leadership was decisive, calm, disciplined, and unyielding. His men fought not just for territory, but for the survival of their homeland. By autumn, the Allied troops had lost all hope of victory. The trenches were now filled with mud and misery. The once bright eyes of young soldiers had grown hollow. Christmas approached, but there was no joy, only the unspoken question: what was this all for? In December 1915, the order finally came: to evacuate. But even the withdrawal had to be done in silence, under the watchful eyes of the enemy, night after night. The soldiers crept to the beaches, their boots muffled in sand, leaving behind rifles propped up by clever tricks to fire automatically, to make it seem as if they were still there. By dawn, on January 9, 1916, the last Allied troops had slipped away. For the first time in months, Gallipoli was quiet. The campaign that had begun with such confidence and ambition ended not with victory, but with a whisper and the haunting knowledge that nothing had been gained, except loss. When the guns finally fell silent, the Gallipoli Peninsula was nothing more than a scarred wasteland. The cliffs were torn apart by shellfire, the beaches littered with rusting helmets and shattered bones. The sea that had carried men to battle now whispered over their graves. In the end, more than 130,000 soldiers were dead. Turks, British, French, Australians, New Zealanders, each one a life cut short by ambition and miscalculation. Nearly 400,000 more were wounded. And for what? The Dardanelles remained in Ottoman hands. No ground was gained. No victory was achieved. For the Allies, Gallipoli was a wound that would not heal. The campaign's failures shattered reputations. Winston Churchill, once so confident in his plan, was forced to resign from his position as First Lord of the Admiralty. His political career seemed over. He later wrote, with a bitterness carved from regret, "I thought we could make war easy and short." and we have learned a terrible lesson. But on the other side of the battlefield, a new leader had risen from the ashes of the Ottoman defense, Mustafa Kemal. His brilliant command during the campaign turned him into a national hero. A decade later, he would lead the birth of a new nation, the Republic of Turkey, and be forever known as Atatürk, father of the Turks. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became something else entirely, a story not of defeat, but of identity. From the blood-soaked beaches of Anzac Cove was born a shared sense of courage and brotherhood that would define both nations for generations. Every year, on April 25th, they remember Anzac Day, not as a day of triumph, but of sacrifice. Still, for those who had fought there, memories of Gallipoli were heavy with ghosts. The smell of the sea mixed forever with the stench of gunpowder. The cries of the wounded haunted their dreams. Many who survived returned home changed, silent, distant, older than their years. On the barren ridges where they once fought, cemeteries now stand, rows of white headstones looking out over the Dardanelles. The wind still carries the same salty air, the same eternal hush. Visitors who walk there today often say they can feel something, not just sorrow, but a kind of peace born from remembrance. Because Gallipoli is more than a battlefield. It is a warning, a reminder of how pride and overconfidence can drown in blood. In the end, the sea keeps its secrets. The tides wash over the forgotten trenches, and the cliffs, once echoing with war, now hear only the cries of seabirds. Yet the memory endures of young men from half a world away, who came seeking glory and found only death. Gallipoli taught the world a cruel truth. War does not create heroes, it only fills graves. As the sun sets over the Dardanelles, the horizon glows red, not from fire, but from memory. And the wind that sweeps across the peninsula still whispers the names of the lost.